The doors to their house were always closed, yet everyone knew something was wrong inside the Folling home. 12 children, one faded photo, and not a single birth certificate among them. No records, no history, no trace. What happened to the Folling children? And why did an entire town choose silence over truth? I returned to the place where it all began, and what I found buried there still keeps me awake at night. They say some truths stay buried not because they're forgotten, but because remembering them would break us. And for the longest time, I told myself I'd made peace with what happened on that hill. The one where the wind never quite dies and the trees bend just a little too low, as if trying to whisper what they've seen. But peace is a lie we tell ourselves when silence is easier than truth. And it was silence that brought me back to Merrill's Edge after 20 years away. Silence and the memory of a name I could never quite place. A name I heard only once in the fevered whisper of my dying grandmother as her fingers trembled and reached for mine. Her voice a barely audible rasp that said, "Folling, don't let them forget the Folling children." And then she was gone, her cloudy eyes still staring past me as if someone or something stood in the corner waiting to collect her. And though I dismissed it as a delirium of old age at the time, that name took root in me, dormant like a seed, pressed into dry soil, until a month ago when I opened the last box of her things and found an old photograph, cracked and fading, of 12 children standing in a line outside a house I vaguely remember from childhood. A house at the very edge of town no one ever spoke, but everyone seemed to know. And in that instant, it wasn't just the image that chilled me. It was the emptiness of the back of the photo, no names, no date, just the faintest imprint of a thumb that had held it long ago, and a smell, faint, musty, like old wood and rotting paper, and something sweeter, like decay masked by perfume. And I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Not the image, not the name, not the memory I'd buried beneath years of city life, late deadlines, and drinks I told myself I needed just to sleep. So I packed a bag and drove 6 hours back to the town where I was born, a town that had aged badly, like a fruit bruised from the inside out. All the more disturbing because it still wore the skin of small-town charm. The flower boxes, the smiling faces, the way everyone greeted each other by name. And yet behind those greetings was a tightness, a guardedness, like everyone had learned to speak, without really saying anything. And I felt at the moment I pulled into the diner off Route 6, the way the waitress's eyes lingered on me a second too long when I gave my name. How her smile faltered just slightly when I mentioned I was doing a story on local history. And then again when I asked about the Folling family. The smile didn't falter that time. It vanished, replaced by a blankness that chilled me more than if she'd screamed, and all she said was, "They're not part of the history we write down," before walking away, leaving my coffee untouched and my questions echoing in the hum of the neon sign outside. And that was the beginning of the unraveling, not the story I thought I was chasing, but myself, because with every step I took into the past, I began to question not only what happened to those 12 children, but how I had lived for so long pretending they didn't matter, as if I hadn't been one of them once, not in name, not officially, but in the ways that matter, lonely, voiceless, discarded, and that memory, that ache of knowing I had looked away, like the rest of them, haunted me as I stood before the gates of the Folling house 3 days later, rusted, crooked, half swallowed by weeds that grew like fingers from the earth. And even though the house beyond was just a silhouette now, its roof caved in, windows black and yawning, it still breathed. In that way old houses sometimes do, not through wind or creaks, but through presence, a heaviness in the air that made every inhale feel like theft. And as I pushed the gate open, it screeched, slicing the silence like a scream. I felt it again, that pull, that strange knowing that I was not the first to return, and maybe not the last, but certainly the only one left who might still remember enough to write it down to make sure their names, if they ever had names, were not erased completely. And I stepped inside, not just a gate, not just a property, but the story itself. And with that step came the memories, subtle at first, like the echo of a lullaby you can't quite place, then clearer, sharper. A girl with ink-stained fingers and a missing tooth who told me she liked the dark because it kept the bad ones away. A boy who never spoke, but always carried a marble in his pocket, rolling it between his fingers like a charm. A tall woman with too tight shoes who smelled of vinegar and loss. The clang of a spoon on tin, the sound of a door locked twice, the hush of footsteps that didn't match the number of children in the hall. And these weren't memories I could have imagined, weren't fragments from a book or story I once read. These were mine, lived, buried, and suddenly unearthed like bones from the frostbitten ground. And I staggered, quite literally staggered, as I stepped onto the porch and felt it would bow beneath me, not from rot, but from memory. And I knew then what I hadn't dared admit. This story wasn't just about the Folling family. It was about me, about what I had survived and forgotten, about why I never told anyone what happened that summer when I was 6 and vanished for 6 weeks, returned with no explanation, no words, just a fever and the image of a house I could never find again until now. And the fear that bloomed in my chest wasn't just about what I might discover. It was about what I already knew, deep down, where the mind tries to hide the worst things. And standing there, staring at that house as the wind picked up and carried with a sound I couldn't quite identify. Was it laughter? Was it crying? I made myself a promise. I would find every piece of the story, every name, every lie, every secret this town had buried, and I would tell it, not just for them, but for me, because truth is the only grave that doesn't rot, and silence is the most dangerous legacy of all. There's a peculiar kind of resistance that doesn't come in the form of denial or anger, but in the carefully curated silence of community that has lived too long with secrets pressed under its skin, and that was the wall I hit the morning after I visited the Folling house, when I walked into the town clerk's office with a notebook full of questions and a reporter's license that hadn't been used in over a year, but still carried enough weight to open most doors. Most, but not this one. Because the moment I asked for birth records, census data, or property documents tied to the Folling name, the woman behind the desk stiffened like I'd thrown a match into a room full of gas, her smile freezing into something brittle and wrong. And she said very simply, "That family doesn't come up in our files." Which should have been a lie, obviously was a lie, because everyone in town knew the Follings existed. And yet here was a bureaucratic erasure so complete it felt orchestrated. And when I pressed, she leaned closer, voice lowered, eyes suddenly cautious in a way that made my stomach tighten, and whispered, "It's not a good idea to go chasing ghosts around here." Then handed me a folder that had nothing to do with what I'd asked for and turned her attention to the computer screen, effectively ending the conversation. And I stood there stunned, not because I'd hit a dead end, that much I expected, but because the warning wasn't angry or even defensive, it was scared. And fear like that doesn't come from gossip or shame. It comes from knowledge, and I left the office with more questions than answers, the weight of my grandmother's last words pressing harder on my chest, and outside, the town moved around me with eerie precision. People smiling, waving, dogs barking in the distance, the sound of a lawnmower buzzing like a fly in a jar, all of it too normal, too staged, like a set built to distract from what lay behind the curtains. And it was that artificial calm that drove me to the town library, which sat like a tired sentinel at the edge of the square, its bricks faded, its windows cloudy with age, and inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and forgotten pages, a comfort to me in its own way. And I spent hours combing through yearbooks, local newsletters, old microfilm reels, looking for anything that mentioned the Follings, but they weren't in school records, church bulletins, or even a local paper. And that's when I really knew, that this wasn't just neglect or loss. It was erasure, methodical and deliberate, and the more I looked, the clearer it became that everyone had participated in it, whether willingly or under pressure. I couldn't yet say, but when I finally stumbled upon a 1963 article buried deep in a dusty folder of unsorted clippings, my breath caught, because there, in the last paragraph of a story about a town parade, was a mention, just a mention, of young Thomas Folling, age 10, dressed as a scarecrow. And it felt like finding a crack in a dam, a single drop leaking through decades of stone, and I made a copy of that article, hands trembling, heart thudding, because I had proof now, not of wrongdoing, not yet, but of existence. And once something exists, it can be found again. And that night, back in the rented room above the antique shop, I couldn't sleep, not because I was afraid, though I was, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying the looks I'd gotten all day, the way people seemed to pause when I passed by, how conversations still when I entered a room, like I was a virus no one wanted to catch, or worse, a mirror they didn't want to look into. And I realized something then, something I hadn't let myself admit. This town wasn't protecting the Follings. It was protecting itself. And if the children were gone, if their records had been wiped, it wasn't to preserve their dignity. It was to conceal a truth no one wanted to face. And that truth, I was certain, would explain why my grandmother, who had never spoken of fear, who faced death with the calm of someone who had seen too much already, had spent her final breath warning me not to forget them. And the next morning, I returned to the diner, hoping for another conversation with the waitress from before, but she wasn't there, and the woman who replaced her wore a name tag that said Claire and eyes that said, "Don't ask." And when I sat at the counter and casually mentioned I was researching the town's history, she nodded with polite interest, but the moment I said Folling, her face shut down completely, and she walked away without a word. And the man sitting 2 stools down, a wiry old farmer type with a tobacco-stained beard and a John Deere cap, turned to me slowly and said, "Some things are better left alone, son," in a tone that made it clear he wasn't offering advice. He was issuing a warning, and yet something in his eyes, something tired, almost regretful, made me push just a little, and I asked, "Did you know them?" And he looked at me for a long time, then said, "Knew of them," and that distinction, so small but so loaded, told me everything. He hadn't known them. Not really, because no one had, not even people who lived down the road or shared their church pews, because the Follings weren't just a family. They were a secret stitched into the very fabric of this place. And I wondered then, not for the first time, what a community has to bury to become this good at forgetting. And I left the diner with more resolve than ever, heading next to the local school, a squat brick building that looked unchanged since the 50s. And I asked to see archived attendance logs, which earned me a hard stare from the principal, a gray-haired woman named Ms. Lindholm, who reminded me of every stern teacher I'd ever feared. And she told me flatly that student records weren't open to the public, not even to journalists. And when I said I was looking into historical patterns of rural education, her eyes narrowed, and she said, "We don't keep records that far back," which was an obvious lie, as all schools do. And when I asked if she had ever heard of the Folling children, her lips pressed into a line so thin I thought they might vanish. And then she stood and said, "This conversation is over." And I walked out, burning with frustration, but also with a sick sort of exhilaration, because now I knew I was onto something, not just a story, but a wound that had never healed. And as I stood in the parking lot staring at the hills beyond the town, I wondered how many people had walked past the Folling house in its prime, seen the 12 children playing in the yard, or being kept in it, and said nothing, done nothing, because looking too closely meant seeing something you couldn't unsee. And maybe that's what haunted me most of all, the idea that the silence surrounding the Folling family wasn't rooted in fear of punishment or shame, but in a deep collective guilt, the kind that festers and reshapes itself into denial over time. And I thought again of that old photo, the one I found in my grandmother's things, and I began to believe that maybe she had tried to speak once. Maybe she'd even confronted what she saw, and that's why she was silenced, not by force, but by time, by the slow erosion of memory that comes when everyone around you pretends something never happened. And I promised myself that wouldn't be my fate, that I would pull back every layer, knock on every door, and if they wouldn't talk, I'd find someone who would, because buried things don't stay buried forever, especially when the ground itself starts to ache from the weight of them. The house stood like a wound that never closed, its bones brittle with time and its walls leaning in on themselves as though trying to bury whatever truths they still held. And as I approached it again, this time not from curiosity, but with the burden of a past I was beginning to accept as my own, the air grew colder, not with temperature, but with that peculiar stillness that settles around places too long forgotten, like the earth itself has been holding its breath. And the road leading there, Grange Road, had almost disappeared under the weight of time and neglect, more gravel than asphalt now, hemmed in by thickets of brambles and gnarled trees that looked like they were reaching, always reaching, for something lost. And at the end of it, the Folling house loomed in silence, half swallowed by ivy, its porch sagging like a mouth too tired to speak. And I hesitated, not because I was afraid of what I find inside, but because I was afraid of what I might remember, because that house, as broken and empty as it seemed, already lived inside me in ways I couldn't explain, and stepping through its doorway felt less like trespassing and more like crossing back into a dream I'd once escaped from but never truly left, and the floorboards groaned underfoot, each step a reluctant confession, and the smell hit me all at once, mildew, rot, old dust, and something deeper, something beneath all that, the faint trace of something sweet gone sour, like spoiled milk or forgotten fruit, and the air was so thick with it I had to pause and steady myself. pressing a sleeve to my face, heart hammering. And then I began to move, room by room, through the wreckage of a life abandoned, wallpaper curling like dead skin, furniture collapsed under its own age, windows fogged with grime that let the light in only enough to cast long, sorrowful shadows. And then I found them, signs of the children, everywhere, so many that my chest tightened and I had to sit, right there, on the cracked tile of what had once been the kitchen. Because it wasn't just the scattered toys or the tiny shoes lined up by the door that broke me. It was a feeling that they had been here until the very last moment, that they had left not because of time, but because they were taken, swept away, hidden, removed, and no one had come for them, and no one had asked where they'd gone. And what kind of town lets 12 children vanish like that? And what kind of country buries them so deeply? Even their birth certificates don't survive. And I got up then, furious and shaking, and moved through the hallway where faded family photos still hung, their frames warped, glass shattered, and in one, I saw the outline of a woman, tall, pale, with sharp cheekbones and a forced smile, and a man beside her whose eyes seemed to look through the lens, not into it, and between them, a line of children, 12 of them, and it was the same photo from my grandmother's box. But here it was whole, not worn or faded, and I touched it, almost reverently, as if the faces could still feel the warmth of my fingers, and I whispered, "Who were you?" Because names matter. Names are how we anchor ourselves to the world, and they had none, not yet, but I would find them, I would. And upstairs the house grew darker, colder, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones, and the bedrooms were stripped down to mattresses and broken toys, but the walls told their own stories, tallies scratched into paint, initials carved with childish hands, and drawings, so many drawings, of trees, of animals, of eyes, and always of a house, sometimes as one, sometimes not, and always with a door that was never open. And I found one room that must have belonged to the oldest. There were books here, journals, bits of poetry scrawled on the back of homework sheets, and in one corner, a box of cassette tapes, their labels peeled, and I took them knowing they might hold voices I wasn't ready to hear. And in the closet, there was a mural. No, not a mural. A map drawn in charcoal and marker, showing the layout of property, and little red dots all over it, with only one labeled, mine. And I copied it down, every line, because I didn't know what it meant yet, but I would. And when I finally made it to the attic, the door wouldn't budge at first, stuck not by a lock, but by something heavier, something emotional. And when I finally forced it open, the air that rushed out was so stale, so thick, I had to step back. But inside was the strangest thing yet, not debris or dust, but order, rows of boxes stacked neatly, each one labeled not with names, but with numbers, and inside, folded clothes, baby teeth and envelopes, locks of hair, report cards, drawings, notes. Someone had kept everything, archived it, and I stood there, overwhelmed, because it wasn't just that the children had been erased from the world, it was that someone had tried to preserve them here, in secret, like a hidden shrine. And that kind of devotion didn't come from love. It came from guilt and maybe control, and I spent hours cataloging, photographing, touching each item like it might dissolve if I wasn't careful. And when I finally stepped back outside, the sun had long since dipped below the hills, and the wind had picked up again, cold and sharp, and it carried with it a sound I couldn't place. Low, rhythmic, almost like breathing, and I turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the trees and the fading light, and the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not really, not ever. And I drove back in silence, hands tight on the wheel. The map I copied fluttering on the seat beside me like a promise I hadn't yet understood. And when I closed my eyes that night, I dreamed of the house not as it was, but as it had been, full of children's voices, of footsteps in the halls, of eyes watching from the attic windows. And I woke up with a taste of chalk in my mouth and the certainty that whatever happened to them didn't end in that house. It started there. Names carry power, not the mystical kind, but the real, irrefutable weight of identity, of memory, of place in the world. In the days following my visit to Folling House, I couldn't stop thinking about the numbered boxes in the attic, how each one was both a relic and a cry, a plea not to be forgotten, and I laid them out in my mind over and over. Box 1, Box 2, Box 3, all the way to 12, and though they had no names attached, the contents whispered to me in ways I couldn't ignore. A scar with initials embroidered clumsily in yellow thread, MF, A sketch of a bird with the word free scribbled beneath it in shaky print. A list of chores written in 2 different handwritings, one of them clearly that of a child, the other unervingly precise. And as I combed through my notes, cross-referencing the items with the photo from my grandmother's box, the one with the 12 children, I began to assign tentative labels. Not names, not yet, but identifiers. The girl with the missing tooth, the boy with the marble, the one who drew eyes, and I became obsessed with finding something more tangible, something that could hold up to the scrutiny of fact. Because up until now, everything I'd found would still be dismissed as sentimental, inconclusive, the ramblings of a man too entangled in memory. And that wasn't enough. Not for them. Not for me. And it was then that I remembered the map I'd copied from the attic closet, the one with red dots and only one label, mine. And I returned to the house in the early morning, before the sun could fully expose the structure's broken silhouette, and I followed the map's crude landmarks: a twisted tree marked sick root, a rusted barrel with a lid like a jaw, a length of fencing that ended in nothing. And when I reached the first, I found a shallow pit, covered in moss and brittle leaves, and beneath that, a tin lunchbox sealed, shut with tape so old it peeled away like dead skin, and inside were pages, dozens of them, torn from notebooks, margins chewed and stained, filled with writing so dense it looked more like desperate scribbles in communication. And as I read, the world around me dropped away, because here at last were names or beginnings of them. My name is Ellie. I think. That's what she calls me. I think I had another name, but I can't remember. I dream of water and a dog with white fur and a swing that moved on its own. And another note. Ben's not talking again. He's hiding the marble again. He says if they find it, they'll take it like they took Sarah's hair. And another, they call me 7. I think I'm not 7 anymore. But if I say that out loud, I get the closet, and the air thickened around me as I realized these weren't just fragments. They were lived moments archived in panic, in survival, and I dug further, using the map, and unearthed more containers, each with more notes, more signs of presence. A chipped ballerina figurine, a crumpled school assignment with a red X through it, and always more writing, some coherent, some spiraling into drawings, but all threaded with one common theme: a longing for identity, for recognition, for someone to say, "You were here, you mattered." And I gathered it all, brought it back to my temporary room, and laid it out like an exhibit, and that night I sat for hours sorting through every word, every scrawl, building profiles, matching drawings to the faces in the photo, and one name kept appearing more than the others. Ellie, Ellie, Ellie. Sometimes written with flowers around it, sometimes scratched into margins, sometimes crossed out, replaced with "it's not." Safe. And I felt a connection to her, not just through her name, but through the tone of her words, the way she questioned herself, the way she seemed to write to someone she hoped would find her one day. And I began to wonder if that someone was me, and though I knew how foolish that sounded, the thought refused to leave me, and I took all of it, every paper, every trinket, every clue, to the town historian, an elderly woman named Doris Callum, who had spent her life collecting Merrill's Edge, memorabilia, and had a reputation for remembering things others had forgotten. And when I laid the materials out before her, her hands trembled as she picked up the notes, and I watched the color drain from her face, and she said very softly, "I thought we destroyed all of this." And when I asked who we was, she looked at me with eyes clouded by too many years of knowing and not saying, and she whispered, "The church, the school board, the town council, everyone who knew but said nothing, because it was easier to believe those children didn't belong to anyone, that they weren't real." And then she began to cry, not the tears of someone caught in a lie, but the sobs of someone who had lived with shame for so long it had hollowed her out. And she told me stories then of how the Follings had taken in children no one wanted, children from troubled homes, runaways, orphans passed through back channels, never officially adopted, never recorded, but dressed and fed and paraded through town on Sundays with matching clothes and plastic smiles. And everyone had played along because the Follings were generous to the church, gave money to the school, held holiday events, and no one wanted to ask why those children never spoke, why they seemed to rotate out every few years, why no one ever saw them grow into adults. And when I asked what happened to them, Doris shook her head and said, "We stopped asking when it became clear the asking wouldn't stop the hurting." And then she looked me dead in the eye and said, "You'll be hated for this, you know, if you publish it. People will say you're lying, that you're disturbed, They'll say those kids never existed. And I left her house with a weight so heavy I couldn't speak. But I also felt something else, a purpose, sharp and undeniable. Because if no one else would give those children names, I would. And I began typing them up that night. A document labeled The Folling 12, with placeholders and descriptions. And for each one, I wrote what I knew, what I suspected, and what I still needed to find. And when I got to the 12th, something happened. My hand froze, not from fatigue, but from memory. Because suddenly I was 6 again, and I remembered the name they called me during that law summer. The one I'd never told anyone. The one I thought was just a dream. And I typed it slowly, letter by letter, Nathan, and I stared at it, numb, until the tears came, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because I wasn't just investigating the story. I was part of it, and maybe I had been all along. There are moments when the pursuit of truth feels noble, even, righteous, when every piece of evidence uncovered is a step closer to justice. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes the truth doesn't liberate you. It cages you. And the morning I opened the 5th drawer of that cracked walnut dresser in the Folling master bedroom, I realized the story I thought I was telling. The story of forgotten children, of a family erased by time, was something far darker, far more deliberate, because inside that drawer wasn't just a piece of the puzzle, it was the key that twisted the whole narrative sideways. And I almost missed it at first, distracted by the usual detritus. Moth-eaten scarves, a broken watch, old photographs so sun-bleached faces had vanished, and then, tucked beneath a false bottom, I only noticed because the lining had peeled back at the edge. There was a folder, stiff with age, sealed with rusted paperclip. And as I pulled it free, dust billowed up like a breath long held, and what I found inside stopped me cold. A letter, handwritten in shaking, careful script, and though the paper was yellowed and fragile, the ink was bold, as if someone had written it in a moment of fevered clarity, and at the top it read, "To whom it may concern." I don't know if this will ever be read, but if it is, then something went wrong, or perhaps, finally, something went right. And I sat down on a warped bed frame to read, heart hammering, breath caught somewhere between dread and hope, and the letter, God, the letter, was from one of the children, not Ellie, but someone who called himself Jude, and he wrote about the house not as a home, but as a machine, a place with routines and rituals, with rules so strict they bled into the bones, and he wrote that none of them were born there, not a single one, and that they didn't arrive through legal means, but through whispers, through trades, through unmarked vans in the dead of night. Children pulled from group homes, runaways scooped off city streets, and in some cases, he believed, from desperate parents who were told their children would have a better life in the country, that they would be raised proper by the God-fearing Follings. And Jude wrote about Mrs. Folling in chilling terms, not as a mother, but as a collector, someone who craved perfection, order, silence, and how she divided them into roles. The quiet ones were praised, the loud ones punished, the creative ones tolerated until they asked too many questions, and then they were disappeared, sent away, or worse. And he spoke of the back room, a place none of them were allowed to go, where screams were muffled by hymns played through an old record player, and of Mr. Folling, who rarely spoke but watched everything, recording notes in small black books that were never found. And Jude believed some of the children were taken not to be raised, but to be used as labor, as currency, as shadows to fill the corners of a life that didn't know how to love. And he described how they were given new names, names that matched the theme, that made them easy to control, and how every trace of who they were before was stripped away, burned or buried, and how the town helped, not directly, not always knowingly, but through silence, through looking away, through accepting donations and smiling at Christmas concerts while pretending not to see the bruises, the fear, the endless rotation of unfamiliar faces. And Jude ended the letter with a single sentence that echoed in my skull like a shot. If someone is reading this, please remember us, not as what they made us, but as what we were before. And I held that letter like a wound, because it wasn't just evidence. It was a soul cry out across decades, and it changed everything, because now I knew the children hadn't been forgotten, they'd been taken, stripped of identity, and folded into a lie that the town had not only accepted, but benefited from. And it made sense now, why the records were gone, why the town clerk and the school principal and even Doris Callum had all hesitated, because this wasn't about shame anymore. It was about complicity, and the rage that surged in me was like fire, not just at the Follings, But every adult who had known and said nothing, at every system that had allowed these children to vanish beneath the surface of bureaucracy. And I thought again of my grandmother, of the things she didn't say, and I wondered if she had tried to stop it once, if she had seen too much and been warned off, and that's why she never spoke until the end. When the weight of silence finally cracked her open, and I left the house in a daze, the letter clutched in my hand, and I drove without thinking, without breathing, until I found myself at the edge of town staring at the river, and the water looked different now, not peaceful but cruel, a current that swept things away before anyone could grab hold. And I wanted to scream, to burn down the courthouse and demand names and answers and blood, but I knew I had to be smarter, because now I had a story that could expose everything, if I could prove it, if I could find others, survivors, witnesses, anything. And I realized that the final step wasn't the house or the town or even the archives. It was people, the ones who lived through it and made it out, and maybe, just maybe, someone else had written something down too. Or better yet, survived in flesh and memory. And that night, as I sat with the letter spread out before me, a name floated back into my mind, one I'd seen on a school record years ago, unrelated at the time, but now pulsing with significance. Jude Farrow, a student who had been enrolled in a foster program in a neighboring county, briefly, before disappearing from the rolls, and I searched every database I could access, every record I could trace, and finally I found a lead, a man living under a different name now, quiet, unassuming, no family listed, just a P.O. box and a history of changing addresses every few years. And I knew it was him. I felt it deep in my bones, and I knew that if he would speak, if he would confirm what the letter had started, then the dam would break and the truth would come flooding in whether the town liked it or not. Because the truth, once unearthed, does not go quietly back into the drawer. It is an ugly phrase, almost casual in its cruelty, a place to put children. But as I dug deeper into how the Folling family amassed 12 children without so much as a single adoption record, that phrase became a sinister mantra echoing through every institution, every system, every corner of the forgotten machinery meant to protect the most vulnerable. Because what I found wasn't a series of accidents or bureaucratic missteps, but a deliberate, sustained pattern of neglect and exploitation. And it started with the homes, the group shelters scattered across rural counties that rarely saw inspections, that were run by underpaid staff and overseen by overworked social workers drowning in caseloads. Places where a child's disappearance would be brushed aside with a forged transfer document or a vague report that they'd run away again. And I read dozens of those reports, combing through public records, archived foster care documents, state audit papers, all of it. And again I saw the same story play out. A child listed as transferred to private care with no follow-up, no destination, just an empty space where a name should have been. And I followed that trail through the corridors of state child services, reading email chains and scanned letters so cold they made my blood freeze, communications that reduce human lives to inventory problems, excess placements, non-viable kinship connections, alternative placement options. And it was in those euphemisms that I saw the Folling's method, not through brute force or abduction, but through the silent agreements that happen when no one wants to deal with a child anymore, when someone comes along promising to take the burden. And that's what the Follings offered. They were a solution, a godsend to overstretched counties and desperate administrators, and they exploited that need with terrifying precision, appearing at just the right time, offering to foster children informally to provide structure and faith to those deemed too unruly or too broken to fit anywhere else. And because they did it without asking for compensation, without demanding oversight, because they claimed it was their calling, their Christian duty, they were welcomed, even praised. And I found letters from county officials thanking them, handwritten notes from church elders extolling their generosity, glowing recommendations from school boards that never once asked why none of the children stayed long enough to graduate. And it made me sick, the way everyone involved had chosen the easy road, had let themselves believe that because the children were quiet, dressed, and seen occasionally in public, everything must be fine. And no one looked closer. No one listened when a child flinched or raised voice or stared too long and exit. And the more I uncovered, the clearer it became that Merrill's Edge wasn't a unique case. It was just one node in a larger network of sanctioned disappearance, where children were filed away like unwanted mail, and the Follings were just particularly adept at disguising their cruelty as charity. And I began calling former case workers, tracking down names from scanned rosters, and most of them didn't return my messages, but one did. A woman named Shelley Brand who had worked at the County Youth Services office in the early 1990s and who now lived 2 states over under her married name. And when we spoke, her voice was quiet but brittle, like someone trying not to break open old wounds. And she told me that she remembered the Follings, not because they were loud or aggressive, but because they were efficient. They always had space, always agreed to take problem cases. And she said she'd had doubts. Once, she visited unannounced and noticed that 2 of the boys seemed drugged, glassy-eyed, and sluggish. And when she asked, Mrs. Folling had smiled and said they'd been sick, and something about that smile had made her skin crawl. And she filed a report, requested a follow-up investigation. But nothing came of it, and she was warned off by her supervisor, told that good families don't deserve suspicion, and she transferred offices soon after, but she never forgot the look in those boys' eyes. And when I told her what I'd found, the letters, the map, the false names, she cried real, painful sobs that felt like they'd been building for decades, and she asked me how many, and I said I wasn't sure yet, but it was more than 12, I could feel it, because if they'd been doing this for years, then 12 was just a number that stayed, not the number that vanished, and the deeper I looked, the more names surfaced. Children who had passed through the Merrow region and were never heard from again. And I found one, a boy named Anthony Cruz, listed as a runaway in 1987, last seen at a gas station 10 miles from Merrow's Edge, and another, Kendra Lewis, age 9, placed in a temporary foster home that never reported her discharge. And I started to see the outlines of a system not just broken but complicit, because the data was there if you knew where to look, if you cared enough to see the patterns. And the rage I felt burned deep, not just at the Follings, but at the machine that fed them, that treated children like administrative errors to be filed away. And I thought again of Ellie's drawings of the eyes and the locked doors and the silence. And I imagined what it must have felt like to realize that no one was coming for you, not your parents, not the state, not the world. And I couldn't breathe, not for a moment, because I knew then what my story had to do. It had to force people to look, to see the faces and the names, and the system that allowed them to disappear. And I began compiling everything, dates, placement files, witness statements, photos, letters, and building a dossier that couldn't be ignored. And as I worked, a strange thing happened. People started reaching out, anonymous messages, emails from burner accounts, phone calls with no caller ID, and each one offered a sliver of confirmation. Someone had seen the Follings pick up a child from a church in upstate New York. Someone else recalled hearing about a child who cried every night in the Folling barn but was gone by spring, and one woman, voice shaking, said, "My sister was one of them. She never came back." And she hung up before I could get her name, but I saved the voicemail, and I played it over and over because her voice was cracked with something I understood. The grief of absence without closure, the ache of someone you love being erased without a trace. And I began to realize that this story wasn't just mine. It wasn't just about what happened in one house. It was about the entire architecture of invisibility that allowed it to happen, about how easy it is to lose children when the world sees them as burdens, and how dangerous it is when those tasked with protecting them decide their job is to maintain order, not to ask questions. And I knew then that I was getting close, that if I could find Jude, if I could get and confirm what the letter had started, I could force this into the light, and maybe, just maybe, I could give those lost children back their names. Sometimes the closest brush with truth comes not from the victims themselves, but from those who dared to speak on their behalf and paid for it. And as my investigation deepened, threading together names and timelines and whispers like a madman piecing together a crime no one wanted solved, I kept circling back to one anomaly, a footnote in an old-school newsletter, dated October 1989, referencing a memorial service held for Ms. Greta Hemsley, a third-grade teacher remembered for her kindness and community devotion. And what caught my attention wasn't the sentiment. It was the timing, because it came just weeks after one of the Folling children, based on everything I'd pieced together, had abruptly vanished from public view. And it wasn't just a coincidence. Not when I found further mentions of Ms. Hemsley's name in handwritten notes from Doris Cowan's personal archives. Cryptic entries like, GH asked too many questions, and Greta tried to file something. School board shut it down. And suddenly Greta Hemsley was no longer a side character in the town's memory. She was a focal point, and I had to know who she was, what she saw, and what happened to her, because if she had noticed what I was now uncovering 3 decades later, and if she had dared to speak aloud, Then she was the first to truly bear witness. And they'd silence her, and I needed to know how and why and what she might have left behind. So I began tracking her past, former students, archive class rosters, even payroll records. And what I found painted a picture of a woman who didn't just teach children. She protected them, loved them, was known to bring extra snacks to those who came to school hungry, to sit with children who cried during recess. And her last class, according to records, included 3 of the following children, though of course not listed under that name, but matched by date, age, and presence in the now familiar family photo I'd found. And the principal at the time, a now retired man named Leonard Ackers, lived alone in a cabin on the far outskirts of town, and when I visited him, posing at first as a documentarian interested in rural education history, his posture relaxed until I mentioned Greta's name, and then it was like watching a man retreating to himself, eyes dimming, jaw tightening, and he said she'd been a good teacher, too good maybe, too curious. And I asked what he meant, and he stared past me and muttered, "She asked about the bruises." She kept asking why the kids wouldn't speak. She filed a report. Next thing we knew, she was gone, and I pressed him, was it suicide, an accident, an illness? And he said, car accident. Rainy night. Drove off the embankment near Harper's Bridge. That's the story they gave us. And I asked, "You don't believe it?" And his voice broke when he said, "They said the road was slick, but the coroner's report vanished. Just gone. Like it was never written. Like she was never buried." And he wouldn't say more, just close the door gently. And I stood there numb, because this wasn't just a pattern now. It was a cover-up, and someone had died trying to expose it, and her death had been folded into the narrative like a discarded page in a book no one was meant to read. And I dug deeper, found a box in the back room of the local library marked Retired Curriculum, and inside, among lesson plans and newsletters, was a folder labeled Hemsley, and within it her handwriting. Notes scrawled on loose paper, observations like child flinch when touched on shoulder, possible trauma, and 2 children in same clothing as last week, neglect, and then a final page, torn and water damaged, reading, "If anything happens to me, look at the Follings. Look at the church records. They're not who they say they are." And I sat there, trembling, because this woman had seen what I was just now beginning to grasp, and she tried to scream into the silence, and they'd buried her, not just her body, but her memory, her warnings, everything. And as I held that page in my hands, I felt a surge of emotion so strong I nearly wept. Grief for her, for the children, for all the people who had tried to speak and were erased. And I knew then that Greta Hemsley was not just a name to add to the file. She was the first thread that could unravel the town complicity. And I called Doris again, this time not to ask, but to confront. And when I told her what I'd found, she didn't deny it, didn't argue. She just said, "Greta was brave. We all failed her." And I asked, "Why didn't anyone help her?" And Doris replied, "Because we were afraid. Because she was right. And because if we helped her, we'd have to see the truth. And the truth was unbearable." And that night, I dreamed of a classroom with no children, of a chalkboard with names that erased themselves as soon as they were written, and of a woman with kind eyes standing at the window, staring out into a storm, waiting for someone who never came. And I woke with resolve like steel. Greta's story would not die in that drawer, not like she did. There's a moment in every investigation when facts stop hiding behind paper and begin bleeding from the mouths of real people. And as I stepped further into the rot beneath Marrow's edge, I realized I had crossed the threshold from research into reckoning, because the town was no longer just a setting. It was a character alive with secrets, its silence no longer passive but pulsing, defensive, reactive, and I could feel it in every glance, in every door that didn't open when I knocked, in the way even the wind seemed to carry a warning now. But I kept going, because silence is not an absence. It's a decision, and every person who had chosen to look away from the falling children had helped bury them. And if I couldn't hold the Fallings accountable, I would hold accountable the system, the town, and the people who chose complicity over courage. And I started with the church, the same whitewashed building that had hosted holiday events, christenings, weddings, funerals, the one that sat at the town's moral center like a monument to selective memory. And I asked to see their donation records, their membership logs, anything that might explain how the Fallings, with no visible means of income, had managed to build so much influence. And the pastor, new, young, uncomfortable, told me most of the records from that time had been lost in a filing system change. But his eyes said otherwise, And when I asked him if he knew about the children, his face went pale, and all he said was, people were grateful. Grateful not to have to look too hard. And I left before my fury could boil over, because I needed answers, not apologies, and I turned next to the neighbors, those who had lived on the edge of the Folling property and had watched the house darken over the years, and one woman, Mrs. Alma Loring, in her 90s now, finally invited me in, her voice shaking as she poured tea she didn't drink, and she said, I saw them, you know, the children, playing sometimes, but never laughing, always so quiet. And when I asked if she ever spoke up, she said, I told my husband once. He told me to hush, said we weren't their keepers, that we owed the Follings our respect. And then she looked at me with eyes glassy from time and regret and said, but I should have done more. I should have knocked on that door. And I told her it wasn't too late, that telling the truth now mattered, and she nodded, tears slipping down her face, and said, you're the first person who ever asked. And I left her house with my hand shaking, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of community that had lived with ghosts and called them memories. And the next day I stood in the town square, recorder in hand, and spoke to anyone who would talk, and most didn't, but a few did, and the stories came in like trickles that built into a stream. A grocer who remembered seeing one of the girls with a split lip and a hollow stare. A former mailman who recalled delivering envelopes addressed only to initials, never names. A barber who said he'd once cut the same boy's hair 3 times under 3 different names. And all of them spoke with the brittle tone of people who had convinced themselves for years that forgetting was a form of kindness, and now faced with the truth, they didn't know how to reconcile what they had ignored. And I understood, not because I excused them, but because I had once done the same, walked away from things too painful to look at, convinced myself that someone else would fix it, speak up, intervene. And it wasn't true then, and it isn't true now. And the guilt that sat in my chest began to transmute into something sharper. Resolve, and the more I asked, the more the stories connected, not just to the Follings, but to the very architecture of the town, the school board that always voted to skip home visits, the council that rejected proposed ordinances for foster oversight, the local paper that stopped publishing letters from concerned residents, labeling them speculative, and each decision, small on its own, stacked atop the next until they formed a wall around the truth. And when I finally tracked down a man named Howard Penner, now nearly 80, who had once been the town's fire marshal, he refused at first to speak. But when I showed him the copy of Jude's letter, he broke. His shoulders hunched, his face crumbled, and he said, I was there the night it all came down, the night they locked that attic for good. And I asked him what he meant, and he told me about a fire in the back shed, about smoke and panic, and children screaming not because of the fire, but because of what might be found in its light. And he said he'd seen one of them running barefoot through the woods. But when he told his chief, he was told to write equipment malfunction and not ask questions, and he'd lived with that silence ever since. And I asked him why he was telling me now, and he said, because you're not just digging, you're remembering, and maybe that means there's still time to make it right. And those words, spoken by a man bent with the weight of secrets, cut deeper than any I'd heard so far, because they acknowledged what I had begun to suspect, that I hadn't come to this town just to uncover the story, but to finish something that had started long ago, and maybe even make peace with a version of myself I hadn't fully accepted. And by the end of that week, I had enough to map the town's silence, to show not just what had happened, but how it had happened, through omissions and deference and the kind of loyalty that festers into rot. And I stood alone in my room, walls covered in notes and photos and timelines, and realized that the community of Merrill's Edge had never lacked witnesses. They had lacked courage, and now, finally, some would begin to find it, and I would be the one to carry it forward. There are places in this world where the air itself remembers pain, where the walls hold on to secrets like scars. And as I stood once more before the Folling house, its windows hollow, its roof sagging like a chest that had exhaled its last breath, I knew that whatever waited in the cellar wasn't just a last piece of story. It was the core, the marrow, the place where everything that had been hidden would finally come to light. And I didn't move quickly, didn't charge to the door with determination or bravado. I walked slowly, deliberately, with the weight of names in my chest and the feel of cold steel in my bones, because this wasn't just about investigation anymore. It was pilgrimage, reckoning. And as I stepped through the house, past the wilted wallpaper and the collapsed staircase and the remains of toys that no child should have been forced to leave behind, I moved toward the kitchen, where the cellar door waited like a wound that scabbed over but never healed, and I hesitated for only a moment before pulling it open, the hinges screaming in protest. The darkness, beyond dense and wet and thick with the scent of something ancient, and I flicked on my flashlight and stepped down slowly, each step creaking beneath me, and the temperature dropped with each footfall until the sweat on my back turned to chills. And when I reached the bottom, I expected clutter, decay, maybe old furniture, or broken jars. But what I found was something far more deliberate and far more devastating. Rows of shelves lining the walls, not dusty or chaotic, but organized, labeled, each holding small boxes, jars, containers marked with numbers and short phrases like teeth, number 4, or hair, number 9. And I felt bile rise in my throat as I realized I was standing in an archive of children, a grotesque museum curated by someone who had long since abandoned the pretense of care and given themselves fully control. And I moved through the space, hand trembling, reading the labels, recognizing patterns, recognizing echoes of the attic above, each child cataloged, not just in memory but in flesh. And there were drawings, too, hung along the back wall like a gallery. Stick figures, suns with 2. Many rays, houses with no doors, and always the same element repeated. Eyes, dozens of them, in corners in the sky, hidden behind windows, watching, always watching. And I realized that these children, even in their most innocent expressions, had understood what it meant to be surveilled, to be possessed. In the far corner of the cellar, behind a makeshift curtain of bedsheets, I found what looked like a crude sleeping area, a mattress on the floor, worn blankets, and a journal, water, stained and torn, but still intact. And as I opened it, I recognized the handwriting. It was Ellie's, and my hand shook as I turned the pages, reading her words, each entry short but potent. Ben won't wake up. They said he ran away, but I heard him crying last night. / my name was not Ellie before. I think it was Maya. I remember a woman with curly hair who sang to me. / if anyone finds this, I'm not bad. I didn't do anything wrong. Please tell someone I was here. And that last line undid me, shattered something in me so completely that I sat down on the cold ground and cried. Not as a journalist, not as a man chasing a story, but as a human being faced with the absolute certainty that people had lived and suffered and begged to be remembered here, and no one had listened. And I looked around the cellar at the careful labels, at the silent pleas etched into every surface, and I felt the overwhelming burden of their silence. Not because it had been empty, but because it had been forced. And I knew now why the cellar had been sealed, why no one in the town had spoken of it. Not because they didn't know it was here, but because they did, because someone somewhere had seen this, had chosen to leave it, and had convinced themselves it was better not to ask questions. And I pulled out my phone, documented everything, every jar, every label, every drawing, every page of Ellie's journal, because these weren't just pieces of evidence. They were testaments, and I would not let them rot in darkness any longer. And as I moved to leave, I saw something else, tucked into the corner behind an overturned crate, a wooden plank nailed to the concrete wall, and scratched into it, almost childlike in its desperation, was a list of names. Not numbers, not code, but names, first names, or a fragment of them, faded and smeared but still legible. Ellie, Jude, Sarah, Ben, Thomas, Micah, Laura, Kay, Isaac, May, Devin, and one more, Nathan, and I staggered backward, breath caught in my throat. Because it wasn't just a list, it was a declaration, a memory chiseled into time itself. And there I was, named, etched, remembered by someone who must have known. And the room spun as I faced a truth I had suspected but never fully embraced, that I had been one of them, one of the 12, that my disappearance as a child, my gaps in memory, my trauma that had no origin story, were all rooted in this house, in this cellar, in this list. And I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was a survivor, and the guilt I had carried for so long, of not knowing, of not remembering, of not doing something sooner, began to twist inside me, not to consume me, but to drive me, because now I understood the full weight of my responsibility, not just to tell this story, but to carry it, to name it, to make sure that no child who was taken, silenced, or broken here would ever be forgotten again. And I left that cellar changed, marked, and absolutely certain that the story I was writing was no longer about uncovering the past. It was about redeeming it. Some truths are so heavy that the only way they survive is in silence, buried beneath layers of new names, new places, new lives built carefully around the absence of what once was. And when I finally found him, Jude, or the man who had once been Jude, it was not the triumphant moment I'd imagined, but something fragile, like standing on cracked ice and knowing the weight of your questions might break everything beneath you, because he didn't welcome me, didn't speak right away, didn't even open the door fully, just stared through the screen, face gaunt and weathered, eyes wary, and I said his name, not the one on the mailbox, but the one in the letters, the one scratched into the wood of that cellar wall. And he flinched, barely, but enough, and I held up the copy of the letter I'd found in the fifth drawer and whispered, "You wrote this, didn't you?" And the silence that followed was so loud I could feel it pressing against my ribs. And then, slowly, with a breath that sounded like it had been held for decades, he opened the door and let me in, and his house was spare, quiet, the kind of place built for keeping the world out. And we sat in the living room, surrounded by blank walls and bookshelves filled with old paperbacks and a single photograph of no one I recognized. And he asked me what I wanted, and I told him the truth, that I wanted to know what happened, not just to the others, but to him and to me. And when I said that last part, his eyes narrowed, and I said, "My name is Nathan," and something shifted in him, something I couldn't name, and he asked me to prove it. And I took out the photo, the names, the journal pages, the map, and he didn't touch them, just looked and said very softly, "I remember you. You were the quiet one." And hearing that, being recognized in a story I had only recently begun to remember as my own, undid me in a way I hadn't expected. And I think he saw that because his voice softened, and he said, "I never thought anyone would come." And I said, "I think we were meant to forget." And he nodded slowly and began to speak, not all at once, not as a confession or a narrative, but in fragments, like memory returning in waves. And he told me about the beginning, about being taken from a shelter in a city he barely remembered, about being promised a family, a home, about the first night at the Folling house and how it smelled of lavender and something sour, how Mrs. Folling gave him a name and a bed and told him he was safe now, and how that safety was conditional, fragile, how it vanished the first time he asked to call someone, the first time he cried at night, the first time he said he remembered something different. And he told me about the rules, the silence during meals, the prayers that weren't prayers but chants, the punishments that came in whispers, the rewards that never felt like kindness, and how they were divided, labeled, monitored, how each child was given a role, a number, and how the ones who failed to fit into their roles disappeared. And he told me about the cellar, how it was never mentioned but always feared, how sometimes they heard noises from below, soft weeping, a dragging sound, the creak of stairs at night, and how they began to whisper stories to each other, invented myths to explain the vanishings, because the truth that children were being removed, replaced, hidden, was too much to bear. And I asked him why he stayed so long, how he survived, and he said, "Because I was good at pretending." And there was no pride in it, just exhaustion. And I asked him why he ran, and he said, "Because one day I couldn't pretend anymore, because I saw what happened to Ellie, and I knew I was next." And I asked what happened to her, but he didn't answer, just looked away, and I knew it wasn't time yet. And instead, I asked him how he escaped, and he told me about a storm, about a power outage, about a moment when the door was unlocked and no one was watching, and how he ran until he couldn't breathe, until he collapsed in the woods, and was found days later by a man who didn't ask questions, who called the state, who got him, placed somewhere new with a new name, and how he never told anyone where he came from, because he was afraid they'd send him back, and how the nightmares never stopped, and how every time he saw a van or heard of him, he'd break out in sweat. And I sat there listening, my heart unraveling, because the story was mine and mine was his, and we were not alone, not anymore. And when I finally asked him if he would go on record, if he would help me bring it all to light, he hesitated, said he didn't. No, said he'd spent a lifetime building silence around himself and didn't know how to live outside it. And I told him I understood truly that I did, but that maybe the only way we ever get free is if we carry this together. And he looked at me with eyes full of memories too big for words and said, "What if it doesn't change anything?" And I said, "Maybe it won't, but it will make them real." And that night we sat together, two broken boys in grown men's bodies, surrounded by ghosts. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. Justice, I've come to understand, is not always loud, not always a trial, not always a headline. not always a gavel slamming or a jail cell locking shut. And as I sat alone in my room days after speaking with Jude, with every piece of the story laid out before me like the anatomy of a wound, I realized the hardest part wasn't uncovering what happened. It was deciding what to do with it. Because the Follings were long dead, the house had shelved itself, the systems that enabled them buried under new budgets, new directors, new denials. And what I held now wasn't a weapon, it was a burden, and I kept asking myself the same impossible question. Who deserves to know? And who will suffer if I tell them? And is truth still worth telling if it brings more pain than peace? And I thought of Jude, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette he never smoked, his eyes emptying out as he relived things no one should ever have to speak aloud. And I thought of the others, Ellie, Ben, Sarah, names carved into wood and scrawled in notebooks, lives that have been reduced to whispers, to boxes in a cellar, to rumors buried in administrative language. And I asked myself, what would they want? And I didn't know the answer. Not really, because I couldn't ask them, and maybe that's what haunted me most. The permanent silence of the ones who didn't make it out, the ones whose only testimony was written in crayon and panic. And I knew the ethical weight of that silence wasn't mine alone to carry. But I carried it anyway, because no one else had, and I remember what Doris Callum had told me about how silence protects not just the guilty, but the fragile, and I wondered, were there still people in Merrill's Edge who knew the full truth, who had survived in some adjacent way, who had told themselves for decades that forgetting was the only way to keep living? And would my story destroy them or free them or both? And I thought of the town itself, of the church, the school, the dusty records, the platitudes, the smiles that stopped just short of the eyes. And I knew that if I published everything, it would break something that had already been breaking for years. And I didn't care about that, not really, because the town didn't deserve protection. But what about the survivors, the quiet ones who had learned to live by pretending none of it had ever happened? And I called Jude again, told him what I planned to do, and asked for his blessing. And he was silent for a long time, and then he said, "Tell it, but don't name me." And I understood, because for him, surviving had always meant control, choosing when to speak, when to vanish, and I would honor that. And I began writing, not as a journalist, not as a man with a platform or an audience, but as someone who had finally remembered enough to grieve, enough to speak. And the words didn't come easily. They spilled out slowly, painfully, like poison being bled from an old wound. And I wrote every name I could verify, every action I could prove, every false document, every conversation, every truth carved into dust and paper and flesh. And I wrote it not as an expose, but as a memorial, a reckoning, a love letter to the lost. And when it was finished, I sent it to Jude, to Doris, to Shelley Brand, and I waited, terrified, for their responses, and one by one they came. Shelley called me crying, thanking me for giving her back her voice. Doris sent a note, shaky and hard to read, that simply said, "You did what we never could." And Jude sent nothing, just a single sentence typed into an email with no subject line. "You remembered us," and I released the story quietly without fanfare under a pseudonym, and watched it spread, not viral, not explosive, but steady, shared in grief and whispers, picked up by advocacy groups, reshared by journalists, cited in articles about systemic failures and forgotten children, and the town responded exactly as I expected, with denial, with fury, with performative outrage. But buried in the noise were smaller voices, real voices, people saying, "I always wondered," or "I remember her," or "I think I was one of them," and those voices mattered. Those voices meant it had not been for nothing. And in the weeks that followed, investigations were reopened, audits launched, memorials quietly discussed. And while I knew no one would be arrested, that no trial would be held, I also knew that a kind of justice had been served, not in punishment, but in memory, in the refusal to let silence win. And I visited the Folling property one last time, stood before the rubble of the house that had once swallowed me whole, and I whispered the names out loud, one by one, like a prayer, like a promise. And when I was done, I said my own name last, and felt something inside me loosen. Finally, like a scream I'd been holding since I was 6 years old had finally run out of breath. There is no ceremony for grief like this, no proper ritual for honoring children who were never named in records, never enrolled in schools long enough to be missed, never given graves that bore their faces. And as I stood at the edge of the land where the Folling house once stood, Now reduced to ashes and debris swept into a landfill by county order, I understood. That closure was a myth we tell ourselves to make sense of the unthinkable, because what happened here could not be closed, only carried. And I carried it in my blood, in my name, in the weight of the air that seemed to hang heavier each time I whispered those 12 names to myself. And even now, with the walls gone, with the cellar filled in, with the last photo archived and the final note published, I felt no triumph, only stillness, a silence that had changed shape, not oppressive now, but sacred, a space carved out by memory and refusal to forget. And around me, nothing grew yet, no grass, no flowers, just dry soil and scattered stones. And I wondered if the earth itself was still mourning, still deciding what could be born here next. And I thought of Ellie's journal, of the page that read, "Please tell someone I was here." And I had told him, I had told everyone, and it still didn't feel like enough. And maybe it never would, because stories like this aren't redeemed. They're acknowledged, and that acknowledgement is what matters. And I stood there alone, not in body, but in the quiet presence of every voice I come to know, voices that had guided me, haunted me, broken me, and rebuilt me. And I felt them not as ghosts, not as specters, but as echoes, reverberations of lives that deserved to be seen. And I closed my eyes and spoke aloud, not to God, not to the town, but to the children themselves, the falling 12, and I told them what had become of their story, how it had been heard, how it had rippled outward, how it had forced people to reckon with what they'd hidden and ignored. And I told them they were real, they were remembered, and nothing could take that from them now. And in that moment, something inside me, something old and broken, shifted, not healed, not fixed, but no longer festering. And I realized that was all I could ask for, not peace, but possibility. And I left the land then, not turning my back on it, but walking forward, carrying their names like a prayer, a protest, a song that could never be unsung. And I returned to my life, not the one I had before, but the one shaped by everything I now knew. And I kept writing, kept asking questions, kept tracing the threads of other stories buried like this one. And sometimes people listened, and sometimes they didn't, but that didn't matter, because I'd learned that the work isn't in being heard. It's in refusing to let the silence return. And I heard from Jude, every so often brief, messages that said things like, "Still here?" or "Read your latest." I never pushed him for more, because I understood now that survival wasn't linear. And sometimes silence was not fear but protection. And I respected that. And I heard from others too, people who had read the story, who had seen themselves in it, who had whispered their own truths into void and found echoes. And I collected their names too, privately, carefully, a new list, a growing one, not of victims, but of witnesses, of survivors, of voices breaking through. And I thought often of my grandmother, of her final words, and I finally understood them, not as warning, but as inheritance, a legacy passed down through blood and silence. And I carry that legacy now not with shame, but with responsibility, because remembering is resistance, and resistance is a form of love. And as I write this final sentence, I offer it not as an ending, but as a beginning, for the children, for the silence, for the story that was never supposed to be told, and for every name still waiting to be spoken aloud.